Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. Today we are going to give a look to fighting stances. So when I'm talking about stances, I'm not talking about your guard position. So if you are in Breve, Porta di Ferro, Posta di Donna or whatever. I'm talking about your position in terms of feet and torso. So you can be either, generally speaking, squared compared to your opponent or bladed. So bladed, you're basically offering a smaller target in a sense. You're offering more your back as a target, let's say, while squared instead you have your chest in front and you're facing your opponent with your hips, well, squared in front of your opponent.
When we are fencing with the longsword, we aren't of course completely bladed with our torso, simply because of the nature of our weapon. We have to grip it with both hands, and so our torso always remains at least at 45 degrees compared to our opponent. While fencing with a one-handed weapon instead, such as the saber, for example, it is far easier to get bladed with our torso too, again, because of the nature of the weapon.
The main advantage of a squared stance is that it offers to us the ability to parry equally, almost, right and left, so outside and inside. Generally speaking, the outside parry is harder, but when we are squared, it is almost equal, so it's easy to parry on the inside line and also on the outside line, and this is something really important. Unluckily, we are playing this kind of thing with lesser mobility. Generally speaking, it is slightly harder to go backward, and so when we are going backward in this kind of case, we are generally walking backward, so we can't do fencing steps backward, which is generally speaking the best option because we are in balance and we can do things in the meantime easily. While being in our bladed stance, instead, we are in the opposite situation. So we have a very balanced footwork forward and backward while using our fencing steps, and it is slightly harder to start with a passing steps.
While talking about moving with single passing steps forward, the frontal stance makes the single step far more accessible in its execution. While being in a bladed stance instead, there is the tendency of rotating the torso, which is very helpful in a sense because it helps landing cuts with an horizontal component more easily, but at the same time it takes a bit more in terms of execution time. So the bladed stance helps more the horizontal component of the cuts, while the frontal stance asks for more vertical actions of linear one, like the thrust or a vertical fendente or sottano. Going back to parries, more specifically to the outside parry, for the bladed stance it is slightly harder to land such a parry. So the motivation behind this is pretty simple. Watch carefully. If I place myself with the sword centered in front of me while sitting in a bladed stance, the sword isn't actually centered in front of my torso. It is, in a sense, already toward my right. In fact, if I keep the hands neutral and I move toward my squared stance, as you may notice, my blade moves toward the outside line consistently. So, while being bladed, it is hard to parry outside, especially with the toe edge, because our blade is, in a sense, already toward the outside, and so we have to make an extreme movement with our arms and our torso to reach that position. Or alternatively, we can rotate on our feet to reach temporarily a frontal stance while parrying. Parrying with the false edge instead is slightly easier. It only asks for a strong torso rotation. This of course has its trade-off anyway, because parrying with the false edge keeps the flat toward the opponent, and so it makes landing a clean riposte with the edge slightly harder.
So while talking instead about starting a fast movement forward, so a series of explosive passing steps, basically running to land a thrust or whatever kind of explosive motion, well, in this case we are more or less in a kind of equal, balanced situation, because in either stance we start our motion more or less in an effective way, but we start it in a slightly different way. So when we are in a bladed stance, we lean forward a little bit and we push ourselves with our front foot. And this is the main propeller for our action. Instead, when we are starting our motion in a squared stance, the back foot is more involved, so we can push ourselves forward with the back foot too. So it is basically as it is for a runner starting his run from the blocks in a competition. It is basically the same kind of motion, lesser extreme of course, but more or less the same case.
Talking about lunges, there is not so much to say. The bladed stance is far better in landing them. They tend to be more explosive and also with more reach if compared to the one landed from a squared stance. Of course, you can still use them anyway, but you just need to know what you can and cannot do with them. The last topic I want to touch is stance length, namely the distance between your front and back foot. While being in a bladed stance, a longer stance gives you more stability, but at the same time it makes your fencing steps slightly harder, which is quite bad. And it also gives you lesser reach while lunging, which again is quite bad. So, long story short, while being in a bladed stance is, generally speaking, slightly better to keep your feet close to each other. While being squared instead, a shorter stance gives you more options of movement, while being just slightly longer with your stance gives you a bit more explosiveness forward when you start an explosive action.
Very good people, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching as always. Remember to drop a sub and a like if you enjoyed the video of course, and to check my Patreon page if you want to help me even more. So, as always, again, thanks for watching and see you next time.